Hey folks, today we're going to talk a little bit about how the chemical messengers in our brain, that is to say neurotransmitters, how they affect or at least are related, associated with the different mental disorders, mental illnesses that a person may experience. So last time we thought a bit about the theoretical coming together of these different types of disorders. I showed you the video where we talked about in my Gen Psych class how the id, ego, and superego can create this type of conflict within the mind that can result in different types of anxiety, for instance. And so that's one kind of theoretical approach to where mental disorders come from. It's very psychological in nature. That is to say, it's really thinking about what's going on in the mind more so than what's going on in the brain, which is a more psychiatric or a more neurological way to think about these disorders. So I also wanted to give you a piece of that as well. I also want to think about how the neurotransmitters in particular in our brain are associated with and may contribute to various mental disorders. Now, one thing that I ask as a psychologist, I am a bit biased in this way. I do tend to think about mental disorders in terms of their psychological aspects more so than their psychiatric or their neurological components or aspects. Those things are important, of course, but as a trained psychologist, that's just the way that I think about things. And one thing that I often pose to folks who really primatize the idea of the chemical messengers being responsible for certain mental disorders, that is to say, somebody who says the reason people are depressed is because they have a chemical imbalance or because they don't have enough serotonin or dopamine or whatever it is. And to me, and to them, I always ask, well, what caused this sudden drop in serotonin? What caused this sudden chemical imbalance? And so I think that we really have to think about what causes, what is contributing, what is the underlying piece, in addition to what are the psychiatric and neurological pieces. Just because for me, and this is just personal to me, and I think maybe personal to psychologists broadly, is that the connection, the association, the correlation between these chemical imbalances and certain mental disorders does not really suggest any type of causation, right? If you've taken a Gen Psych or a statistical psychology course, right, one of the things that we drill in your head is that correlation does not equal causation. And here's a place where I think some people have forgotten that message, right? That the fact that these things are dropping in our brains, and even if there is a causal relationship, even if I can demonstrate that a lack of serotonin can cause depression-like symptoms, that still doesn't give me an understanding of why a person who isn't in some experiment, why in a day-to-day life their serotonin would suddenly drop. So I'm always more interested in that kind of lived piece, that kind of psychogenic piece, right? What is going on in your life? What is going on in the way that you are regarding your life that has caused these symptoms? But it is still, of course, really important and really, just important to understand how these chemical messengers, how this more psychiatric piece is connected to these psychological components that I more ascribe to. So what we're going to do today is take a look at some of the neurotransmitters that seem to me most important, seem to be most what we would say implicated in the types of psychological disorders that are most commonly going to show up in a therapist or a clinician's office in general. So first, I do want to do a little bit of Gen Psych review just in case you've forgotten about this. And so what we're looking at here is just a drawing of a neuron, that is to say a nerve cell. Here is one nerve cell. I've labeled the soma or the cell body, by the way, remembering somatogenic, right? That idea that soma means body. So here we have the cell body. Also, these little extensions off the cell body are called the dendrites. Here, this long shaft is called the axon, which leads into the terminal buttons. The neuron goes in this direction, that is to say, it receives a signal in its dendrites, fires a signal through its axon, and then releases neurotransmitters into what we call the synapse or the synaptic cleft. And again, the synaptic cleft is just the space between the neurons. And so the neuron, the previous neuron, will release its neurotransmitters, that is to say those chemical messengers that we're about to talk about, into the synaptic cleft or into the synapse, and then those will get picked up by the dendrites of the next neuron, and that process will continue until the message gets where it's going. And so here's what we're interested in, right? Here we are interested in these neurotransmitters, which are just these chemical messengers, right? They are fired by neurons to other neurons, sometimes to other organs, usually muscles, that can also communicate some message, can tell that this message needs to go to some other place, or that this landing spot, this place where the message is going, that this thing needs to happen, or that this thing needs to stop happening. Now, there are a lot of neurotransmitters, but again, we're really just interested in the few that are responsible for psychological outcomes, psychological conditions. And so we're not going to have an exhaustive list here, but these are of the most important ones, and then including these other two, which we'll talk about as well, glutamate and GABA. So at first, I just want to start with what's probably one of the most well-known neurotransmitters in terms of, again, mental disorders or any type of psychological issues, and that is serotonin. Now, serotonin is one of these neurotransmitters that we have a real connection with in terms of depression. It is something that we've at least found to be effective or found to be associated with a lot of depression symptoms. And so therefore a lot of modern depression, psychiatric at least, treatments, it is to say medication as treatment for depression, is really going to be affecting a person's serotonin. But before we get quite into that, one of the things that I like to do when we're looking at these is, as I have this laid out here, so we're going to look at serotonin, we're going to look at what it has a role in, or sometimes what you hear folks say, what it's implicated in. We say role in or implicated in versus causes or even connected to, because we really don't know how the brain works very well. And you've probably heard that stated in other classes or maybe on television in some way, but this is where we can see that happening. So we have a sense that serotonin, for instance, is related to mood, is related to sleep, but we don't know what is known as the mechanism of action. That is to say, we don't know what's going on the chemical or the cellular level that's making serotonin make a person sleep better, or a lack of serotonin making a person sleep worse. All we know is that if we give a person serotonin, they seem to have better sleep. And if we can tell by some type of longitudinal study that an individual is lacking serotonin, that is to say, they've had a drop in serotonin from what they have usually tested at having, then that person will likely have some disruptions to their sleep, sleeping too much, sleeping too little, not getting restful sleep, whatever it is. We just know that there's this relationship, but we don't know how it's happening, right? We don't know if serotonin is entering the cells and making them sleepy or giving them more energy or charging them up in some way, right? We don't know what's happening. We just know that it happens, right? We just know that if you give a person serotonin, or if they are lacking serotonin, that these are the things that will happen. We have no clue in terms of what the brain is doing or what any other part of the body really is doing with some of these neurotransmitters that make this psychological effect show up. We have some hints. If we have some time, I may talk about those. But in general, again, we really just don't know. We just know that they're related. So serotonin has a role in addition to sleep, also has a role in mood. When we say mood here, generally we just mean kind of feeling up or feeling down. That is to say, whether a person has a sense of well-being, whether they're feeling in very low sense depressed or in a very high sense manic, right? So the serotonin is really connected to this kind of straightforward sense of mood. Do you feel good? Do you feel bad? Also connected to appetite, also connected to learning, and also connected to memory. One thing I should add up here, it does say mood, but the way that serotonin feels, if we can describe how serotonin feels, is it really gives you a sense of well-being. So in terms of not feeling depressed, in terms of feeling good, serotonin does not feel like pleasure, it does not feel like elation, it doesn't even necessarily feel like joy. What it really just feels like is contentment. It feels like I'm fine, I feel pretty good. You know, nothing's wrong, I feel happy, I'm not too hot, I'm not too cold, I'm well fed, right? All of these different things that are, I'm rested, I'm well fed, I feel good in terms of my cognitive capabilities. All of these things are what we would associate with serotonin, right? This sense of well-being is the broader psychological piece. And so you can see, for instance, how if you don't have that sense of well-being, that can easily be a part of, or perhaps even lead to, some type of depression or anxiety, right? We were talking about that idea last time of a dystonic, an ego dystonic feeling, right? Depression and anxiety tend to be ego dystonic. And so that sense of just not feeling good, that sense of this isn't how I want to be, things aren't right? That is usually connected to serotonin. That sense of well-being is really what comes through with serotonin. And so when you're lacking it, we can start to think about when you're lacking it and these things start to become problematic and you don't have a good sense of well-being, well then what are we looking at, right? And so we can see depression in terms of this as a symptom list. When I say rolling, we could also think about this as a bit of a clue in terms of what diagnoses via these symptoms might be attributed to this neurotransmitter. And so if a person's having trouble with their mood, they don't feel good, they're not able to sleep, they don't have a good appetite, they're not remembering things very well, well then we would associate that with depression, right? And if we look at the DSM's diagnostic criteria for depression, we're going to find a lot of these very same things. Now, serotonin probably isn't the only thing that's going to be going on if somebody has depression. So this list isn't completely exhaustive, right? You might also have some other things going on where, I don't know, you're angry or you're crying a lot. And maybe that's in mood and well-being, but maybe not. Or you can't experience happiness. So not only do you not feel good or have a sense of well-being or contentment day to day, even when you do something that should be exciting or happy to you, right, that thing doesn't come through. So I'm just saying all this to say that, right, this isn't an exhaustive list, but you can look here and begin to see, oh, this is depression. If a person has problems in these areas, we might, begin to think that there's something going on with depression or anxiety, right? If you think about maybe being too nervous to eat, being too nervous to remember or to learn or to sleep, right? And then your mood being, again, not feeling good. This does not feel good, how anxious I am. This does not feel good, how nervous or guilty or ashamed or whatever it is that your anxiety is. You can see that might also affect these things that we're saying are connected to serotonin. Then bipolar, of course, is kind of an extension of depression, and then of course that other piece of that mood, right, that manic piece, is also going to be connected here to serotonin. And then lastly, what I like to do on this list is just look at any type of drugs, both prescribed drugs and then also street or recreational drugs that might be connected or might increase or propagate serotonin in an individual. And then we'll do this, of course, for all of the rest of these neurotransmitters. So what you see here is that many antidepressants are going to use serotonin in some way. So these are going to be things like SSRIs, which is serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors, and then SNRIs, and there's a bunch of different serotonin using antidepressants, the vast majority of modern antidepressants are going to affect your serotonin. I have to give this little warning about serotonin though. And that is something that we call Serotonin Syndrome. So unlike some of these other neurotransmitters, serotonin is a little bit more sensitive. That is to say, it's trickier to kind of get it in this place where you feel good, it's functioning properly, there's no withdrawal effects, right? It's tricky to kind of get it in this perfectly balanced place. It is a sensitive neurotransmitter. And so what can happen for some folks is, let's say that you've gone to a psychiatrist and they've prescribed you some type of SSRI, some type of serotonin inducing or serotonin keeping is really what's going on, medication, right? To help put more serotonin or leave more serotonin in your brain, you've been prescribed an SSRI, okay? So, and you're on this for a little while and it's doing its trick, and you know what, you feel so good this weekend that you're gonna go out to, I don't know, a rave. I don't know if people go to raves anymore, but you go to a rave, you find one in Warrensburg, and you decide that you're gonna do some Molly at this rave. And here you see, of course, that Molly is a serotonin-inducing street drug or a recreational drug. I've indicated those with the stars, by the way. And what can happen here is if you're taking an SSRI and that's already leaving excess serotonin in your brain, and then you take MDMA or ecstasy or Molly, and that is also increasing the serotonin in your brain, you can get this really high spike of serotonin. Now, if you've ever taken any of these drugs, from what I hear, they feel really good. And in the moment, in the time, you're gonna feel great. You're gonna have a really, really elated sense of well-being, right? Again, it's not quite pleasure, it's not quite elation, it's not quite, you know, joy or excitement, but you're just gonna feel really good, right? But what will happen is as the Molly leaves your system, and because you've had such a spike of serotonin given the addition of the SSRI that you may be taking, well, that come down is gonna be really intense. Now, most folks who've taken MDMA or some version of that understand that they're gonna have kind of a blue day, or they're gonna have kind of a low day after maybe partying on one of these drugs. And so that's somewhat to be expected, though still potentially problematic. But what happens with serotonin syndrome is that this doesn't just last a day or two. This can last weeks to months. And so I had a client when I was working as a clinician in the past, and here was a guy that I was working with through some anxiety-related things, and he started taking an anxiolytic. Anxiolytic just means an anti-anxiety medication that had some serotonin in it, or at least provoked serotonin in his own body. And we were working together for a while. At the end of, I think it was a spring semester, he said, you know what, this has been great. I'm gonna go away for the summer. I think this will be enough therapy. I think when I get back, I'll be able to work through things on my own. And as a therapist, you wanna hear that, especially if you agree with him, especially if you think, yeah, I think this person's ready to go. I was just waiting on you to say it, right? And so we were at that place. And so I was happy to see him ready to take the reins back of his life. And so summer goes, and then we come back for school, and there he is on my schedule again, right away in the fall. And I'm wondering, you know, what happened? He said he was ready to go. Maybe something bad happened over the summer. Maybe he lost somebody, something like this. Well, it turned out that he had been continuing to take his medication as prescribed, but right before school started, he went to a party and did some Molly, and inexplicably felt like after that he did not know why he was feeling so sad, did not know why he was feeling so demotivated and just not good. And this went on for a few weeks for him. It went on a few weeks before school started, and then a few weeks into him coming in and meeting with me. And so basically we figured out that he had this serotonin syndrome, the serotonin sickness, where he basically overdosed on serotonin, and now he was in this really extended withdrawal phase where he was just gonna be sad. There was nothing problematic going on in his life. It was a senior year. He was excited to be back at school. Relationships, friendships were good, but yet he still just had this sadness that he couldn't escape, and it turned out to be just a chemical imbalance. Right, here's a time where that makes sense, but it was done to him, right? It was something, or at least he did to himself. It wasn't just a sporadic, your serotonin drops, it's you fed yourself too much serotonin and now your body thinks you're just gonna keep doing that, so why make my own? All right, so the next neurotransmitter here that we have is dopamine. And dopamine is a pretty expansive neurotransmitter. It's one, as you can see here, that's involved in quite a lot of things. So it's involved in cognition, that is to say our thought process, our thinking. It's involved in our sense of reward and punishment, right? What's a thing, and this is in a very behavioral sense, that is to say, what's a thing that's rewarded me such that I want to do it more, and what's a thing that's maybe punished me such that I want to do it less. Dopamine is really tied up in that connection of we're learning something because we've been rewarded for it, or we're gonna learn to not do something because we've been punished for it. Motivation in that same regard, right? If you're rewarded, you're gonna be more motivated to do something. If you're punished, you're gonna be more motivated to do something. That is to say, stay away from whatever it was that punished you. Your attention, also some aspects of your mood. Pleasure, I should have written this first, I should have written pleasure first, because really dopamine is your body's way of communicating pleasure to you. It's how it's training you, basically, right? In the absence of that pleasure, or in the abundance of that pleasure, right? There's a way of training you internally, right? I've done this, I feel good about the fact that I did that, that's a reward, there's your dopamine, I'm more likely to do that again. I forgot to do this, I feel really bad, everybody thinks I'm an idiot, there's my lack of dopamine, and so I'm gonna be less likely to do that in the future. Again, also, sleep, voluntary movement, this is really complicated stuff, but basically dopamine works by stopping you from moving involuntarily. Our movement is weird. It isn't like we're just completely at rest, normally, and when we want to move, our brain just kind of kicks us into movement. But really, our body wants to just kind of move randomly all the time. And so one of the things that dopamine does is it sends a signal to keep that movement gate shut. There's sort of these gates in our brain, basically, that say move, don't move, and if left just completely open, we just move randomly. And so you have to kind of close some of those gates to stay still, and then you open them in different sequences to move in certain ways. But what dopamine is doing here is keeping you still. It seems like it's kind of an excitatory thing, but again, dopamine is exciting the part of your brain that stops your muscles from moving. And so if you don't have enough dopamine, what will happen is you'll just move involuntarily. You might see a hint over here as to what that looks like. Also involved in learning, and then also involved in short-term memory. These are connected, right? If you can't remember what I just said about involuntary movement, it's gonna be hard for you to learn it, right? And so because dopamine, again, is either rewarding or punishing us for learning, is this interesting, am I paying attention? Wow, that's really cool. I'm rewarding myself by listening, and therefore am more able to learn it. And maybe you're the type of person who this is really boring, and this is a punishment, and I'm having a hard time remembering what you just said. And again, that's going to be connected to that sense of short-term memory. Are you holding on to those pieces, or are they just going in one ear or out the other? So folks that have issues with dopamine, I forgot a big one. Folks that have issues with dopamine, or some of the disorders that are most connected with, in these cases, too little dopamine, are going to be ADHD is going to be one of the biggest ones. That is to say, these folks have a really hard time stopping themselves from not paying attention, keeping themselves motivated, keeping themselves in a mood where they can do the work that they need to do for a day or whatever it is. So ADHD is going to be a big one in here. Tourette's, right? There's the thing that I was kind of hinting at in terms of voluntary movement. In terms of if you don't have enough dopamine, what can happen is that those gates that stop you from moving randomly aren't going to be able to stay shut as much, and so you might have a person who's got these tics. Now, again, that's really complicated, and so often folks who have Tourette's, you can't just give them dopamine. In many cases, something that would provoke dopamine, because in many cases that will actually result in more tics. If you remember, that kind of gated dopamine system is complicated, so it's not just as straightforward in Tourette's case of giving more. Sometimes that can cause more Tourette symptoms. That can cause more of that involuntary movement. Anxiety, of course, and this is going to be anxiety, of course, associated with mood, of course, associated with a sense of reward or punishment, right? What's going to happen if I forget to do that thing again? What's going to happen if I don't show up, or again, you feel guilty for something that you forgot to do? And then similarly, depression in terms of mood. Parkinson's, again, in terms of that movement piece. Now, with Parkinson's, this often is also related to some brain degeneration, not just neurotransmitter, relays or interactions. But we do see that Parkinson's also does seem to be related. Now, this isn't the kind of Tourette's where you suddenly have a movement. This is kind of the shaky movement, right? Still that inability to keep your body from standing still is what's going on in Parkinson's disease. And then schizophrenia is different. In fact, schizophrenia, unlike these other ones, which are related to low dopamine, is actually related to too high dopamine. Folks with schizophrenia seem to not be able to stop themselves from getting carried away with the imaginings of their mind. It's a little bit too busy, too creative, and they stop being able to delineate what's real from what's a created idea or created sensory experience from their own mind. And so folks with too much dopamine, again, are usually going to have some type of schizophrenia. Now, not too much. Too much just means basically that it's caused a problem. There isn't some level that we expect a person to have, but too much for them is likely to cause some type of schizophrenia or psychosis, again, where they can't tell from the next. And then too little, again, is going to be associated with these things. Nearly all recreational drugs use some type or in part or increase the dopamine in your brain. Nearly all recreational drugs. This is because dopamine basically is pleasure. And so any drug that you're taking to just feel good, any drug that you're taking to relax or kind of get any sense of pleasure out of it is gonna trigger the dopamine in your brain. Now, not all drugs are doing this, you might say on purpose. It just might be this ancillary piece, this connected piece of, you saw a movie that you liked and that released dopamine, or you ate a food that you really enjoy and that released dopamine. The food doesn't have dopamine in it, or the food isn't designed to have this effect, but because you like it, it releases dopamine. And so very similarly, we can say this for many, if not all, recreational drugs. Some of them are going to release dopamine directly or increase it directly. Others of them, you just like it, and so that is gonna increase the dopamine. An example of that might be something like drinking alcohol, which isn't really going to increase the dopamine in your brain directly or even as a byproduct, but because you like it and you're enjoying that experience, if you do, then you're going to have, again, that sort of reward, pleasure, that's just going to be connected to that motivation. I'm motivated to drink it again because I liked it, right? ADHD stimulant medications, for instance, Adderall or Ritalin, things like this, 5-ANTs, even some of the new ones. These are going to act directly on dopamine. These are things that are triggering dopamine in particular, or trying to act on it because of its connection to ADHD, because of its connection to all of these things that, again, if we add them up, actually look a lot like ADHD for the most part. And so because it's so connected, medications that are trying to tackle this in particular are really going to go right after dopamine. It's going to try to stimulate that person into a place of being able to tolerate sitting still, et cetera, et cetera. Some antidepressants are going to use dopamine. Now, dopamine in terms of pleasure versus serotonin, that is to say, with relation to depression symptomology, dopamine feels like joy, it feels like excitement, it feels like elation, it feels like happiness, right? It's the big happy, right? Where serotonin's kind of the little, small, simple happy. I just feel good. Dopamine, I feel good, right? These are the different ways in which these neurotransmitters act. And so antidepressants that are going to include some type of dopamine are going to impart more of that sort of euphoric, that happier, that joyful type of well-being, in addition to, certainly if they're doing something with serotonin as well, in addition to that sense of just well-being, that I can just sit here and be happy with myself. Similarly, some anxiolytics are gonna use dopamine for that same reason. And in fact, some of these ADHD stimulant medications, are also used as antidepressants and anxiolytics, again, which are just anti-anxiety medications. I was seeing a client in the past who was prescribed Adderall. He did have ADHD, but he also had bipolar, and the doctor, his psychiatrist, felt like the Adderall was going to be able to cover sort of both of those aspects for him. And so it's got these kind of broader qualities to it. And then marijuana is going to be one of the street drugs, or one of the recreational drugs that really does work directly on dopamine. Marijuana is a strange substance, right? Because it doesn't necessarily hit all of these. It does hit them in some specific ways, but you don't necessarily feel that sense of elation or excitement. It certainly isn't helpful in terms of a short-term memory, these type of things. And so marijuana kind of hits it in a very specified way, right? It is going to do some stuff for cognition, maybe not in the right direction, but it's going to do some stuff for cognition. It's going to do some stuff for motivation. Again, maybe not in the right direction, maybe depends on what you're using. Gonna do stuff for attention, gonna probably in most cases make you feel a little bit better, gonna get a sense of pleasure, gonna be able to sleep pretty easily. I don't know if there's any issues of control and movement that I've heard of related to marijuana, but certainly that idea of just being able to stay still for a long time. And then it's gonna affect your learning, certainly your short-term memory, certainly, right? So these are kind of going in different directions in some ways, but you can see that marijuana is having this effect on dopamine, unlike some of the other drugs, which again are kind of having this byproduct effect. It's just happening because you like it, versus that's almost what the drug is intended to do. Marijuana is a plant, so it doesn't have an intention, but you know what I mean. All right, so let's look at these last two, which are norepinephrine and acetylcholine. Wish I could just pause this in 8 minutes. So let's look at these last two, which are norepinephrine and acetylcholine. These two are a little bit less involved. Dopamine and serotonin are definitely the big two in terms of what we think about when we're looking at psychiatric or psychological illnesses and how these chemicals affect them. But these two are also important, so let's take a little look at these. Norepinephrine, you've probably seen it as epinephrine or ephedrine or adrenaline. All of these substances are really similar in terms of their chemical makeup. And so if you can think of adrenaline, you can kind of think about what norepinephrine's doing. Norepinephrine is doing. I just randomly remember I spelled this word wrong, so I'm going to fix this. So, right here, right, that sense of fight or flight, that adrenaline that you would get if you were in a dangerous or just scary situation, that you might feel that sense of fight or flight, right, that adrenaline. That's what norepinephrine is doing in your body. It really is giving you this rush in terms of regulating your heart rate and blood flow, and then connected to that, right, your psychological excitement that may need to go with the fact that you've got increased blood flow and heart rate, right, that you might need to run really fast to get out of there, or you might need to lift the car off of, you know, the deer that you hit, whatever, sorry. So norepinephrine is associated with stress and attention, responding actions. This really just means like reflexes, right? Something happens, what do you do right after it, right? Not necessarily thinking about it, not a voluntary action, but do you hit it, do you run, do you freeze, right? These types of things are what they're talking about, again, connected to that epinephrine, that adrenaline. And then in terms of psychological disorders, these are things that are really sort of loosely related, if I had to say. These aren't necessarily going to be the things, or I should say norepinephrine is not going to be as big of an effect on these as, say, serotonin and dopamine from what we understand. So what we've got here, of course, is anxiety and depression. You're going to see this in most of these, but also, of course, ADHD. Here's the one where I've seen it most often used specifically, is in ADHD medications. Adderall, in addition to working on dopamine, also affects norepinephrine as a way of addressing this ADHD, right? Trying to give you this sense of attention, and then maybe also some de-stressing actions there. De-stressing in the moment, and then flooding back afterwards, right? And then some of the street drugs, of course, are going to be meth and cocaine, very similar to Adderall, of course, and then cocaine. Again, thinking about that sort of that fight or flight, that adrenaline, those pieces, right? You can see that these are the types of drugs, even if you've never taken them, hopefully, but maybe you've heard of them, right? Or just seen them on TV depictions, right? This is the type of reaction you would expect with a cocaine or a meth, right? Just a really excited, you know, freaking out, more than the dopamine where you're just happy, right? This is, you're kind of losing your mind type of thing with too much of it. Of course, it's important for all the other stuff. Lastly, acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is something that I think is becoming more and more popular in terms of psychiatric, neurological, and then psychological study. And that has to do with the fact that we found it has a pretty big connection with dementia. So what we know about acetylcholine is that it affects focus, it affects alertness, it affects learning, memory, sustained attention, and sleep. It's sort of the feeling that you get on caffeine, if I can point to something that maybe folks have had some familiarity with, right? It gives you this, you know, it's certainly not adrenaline or meth or any of these other pieces, but it does kind of give you this sort of closed-in ability to focus, kind of waking you up a bit, right? Letting you maybe remember things a little bit better. And so these are some of the things that you're going to see that are going to be associated with acetylcholine. Now, acetylcholine isn't caffeine, but I just mean to point out that it has this sort of mild stimulant effect when we would compare it to something like norepinephrine or dopamine, which also have these sort of stimulating effects, but acetylcholine is a little bit quieter. It's a little headier versus being in your body, even the way that dopamine can feel like it's in your body. So connected to these things, right? I'll read them again: focus, alertness, learning, memory, sustained attention, and REM sleep, that is dreaming sleep. And then the diagnoses that it's associated with are going to be anxiety, again ADHD, and then dementia. And then dementia is the one, again, that we're finding the most interesting science around. I had a student that I did some research with in the past, and she was researching acetylcholine receptors and dementia in, I think she was using mice or some type of lab animal. She wasn't using humans, but the idea was that folks who, for instance, have more acetylcholine receptors, that is to say, if here's an acetylcholine receptor and you've got them with a lot more branches and you've got a lot more just of them in general with a lot more branches, right? That folks who had more acetylcholine receptors were less likely to be dementia or have symptoms of dementia. That's things like Alzheimer's, where you're forgetful, where you start slowing down cognitively. All of those things are considered dementia. But that folks who had more acetylcholine receptors, who had more places for the acetylcholine to go, right? So maybe these go up here and these go down here, that those folks were less likely to have dementia or Alzheimer's related conditions in old age. Well, where do you get more acetylcholine receptors? Of course, there's just going to be some variability based on individuals and maybe diet and lifestyle, et cetera, et cetera. But one thing that we have been able to illustrate is that for all of the terrible things that we do say about smoking, it does seem that nicotine has a beneficial cognitive effect, at least in the long run. Turns out that folks who smoked throughout their life or at some point throughout their life were less likely in a longitudinal study to develop dementia or Alzheimer's or these type of psychological disorders. And what we know from this type of research, the type of research my student was doing, is that when you smoke, when you use nicotine, it doesn't have to be smoking, it could be gum, it could be, there's all sorts of ways, dip in or something, not that any of those are safer than the others, but when you use nicotine, it develops these other sets of receptors in your brain, right? Your brain just gets used to receiving nicotine, so it's going to say, hey, we need to make sure that we can pick that up and make sure it's useful, so we're going to grow all of these receptors such that we have a place to put it. And it turns out that when a person has dementia, when they've got some type of Alzheimer's, for instance, one of the things that starts to happen is they start getting these plaques and tangles on these receptors. But guess what? If you smoked or used nicotine or some other thing that created all of these extra receptors, well, you've still got a bunch of places for these to go, right? Even though some of them got nastied up, even though some of them got infected or tangled, because you had all of these extras, because your brain had made more, because you were imparting nicotine at some point in your life, well, now there's still enough place for this stuff to go, such that you can remain focused, alert, be able to learn, have sustained attention, memory, and dreaming sleep, right? All of these are things, by the way, which we would expect a person to lose should they have some sort of dementia. And so this is just a really interesting thing to me, right? This one thing that we thought is really dangerous, and it still is in terms of cardiovascular events, in terms of lung events, right? All of these other things that we know smoking in particular is bad for, but we do find this one thing that it seems to be protective against. I find that pretty fascinating. Okay, last thing for real is just looking at this difference between glutamate and GABA. Glutamate is basically the neurotransmitter that tells your nervous system to go, do more of whatever it is you're doing, or whatever it is, the thing that you do. And GABA is the opposite. GABA says stop. Whatever it is that you're doing, or whatever it is the thing that you do, stop doing that. Slow that thing down. So these two are one of the main neurotransmitters in our body, beyond just our brain and in our entire body, such that they have a very kind of universal effect. Again, that effect of just do more or do less, or start or stop, right? It's just kind of on or off, black or white. And so with these tend to be associated with broadly, in addition to a lot of things, we're not going to get the whole chart here, but these are often very associated with anxiety. That is to say, when your nervous system is firing too much, when it's having an overreaction, that seems to be really connected to anxiety. One of the interesting things I find here is that glutamate is actually really connected to histamine. Where have you heard that? Probably in an antihistamine. What does an antihistamine do? Well, it stops your other parts of your nervous system from having this overreaction to some substance that's touched your body or that you've ingested, right? It stops you from having some type of allergic physical reaction. I'm starting to get the sense that anxiety is a bit of an allergic reaction of the mind. That it is this sort of overreaction to some stimulus, right? I've got a test tomorrow. Oh my God, I'm freaking out. I had a panic attack, right? Maybe you should be a little bit nervous, but having this overreaction is akin to, you got some cat dander on your arm and now you're breaking out in hives, right? That's, maybe it's itchy and you want to get it off, but the fact that you're having hives is akin to a panic attack. So, GABA is the thing that sort of counteracts this, right? Glutamate comes in and says get worked up, or histamine in some cases, right? These are really related. I think one turns into the other. And so these would come in and say get worked up, and what GABA does again is come in and say, no, settle down. Now, GABA isn't connected to antihistamine the way that glutamate is connected to histamine, but just that idea of them sort of working against each other. And so what we do tend to see, just in terms of finishing off this chart, is that if we want somebody to have less anxiety, instead of giving them a GABA medication, we usually give them some type of medication that slows down glutamate, that just stops glutamate from happening. Apparently, if you give folks GABA, it can just slow down too much. It's harder to control exactly what's being stopped versus telling glutamate, just don't overreact in the first place. And so usually when we're giving somebody some anti-anxiety, some type of anxiolytic medication, usually it's an anti-glutamate medication, though you've seen here that there are some other ways to begin to treat that. Lastly, I will say, in terms of what types of street drugs or recreational drugs are associated with glutamate and GABA, well, there is one missing here. My students always fail to remember it, but it is, of course, alcohol. If you're wondering what neurotransmitter alcohol affects, it is glutamate and GABA. And so that effect of, if you've been drunk before, right, where you feel slowed down, you can't think as fast. You feel like you're thinking as fast, but the thing went by before you had a chance to decide to catch it or to talk to it or whatever it is, right? But the fact that you have this sort of slowed down in movement, slowed down in thought, right, is what's going on when you've got excessive GABA or not enough glutamate in your body, right? You have this sort of slow, stop, take your time kind of reaction. Again, GABA's the slowing down, glutamate's the speeding up, and so you can see how they sort of work together. It's why a lot of folks drink because of nerves, right? It's why a lot of folks will want to have a drink to calm their nerves, and as long as you're not overindulging, right, that is actually a pretty insightful thing to do, because if you are sort of overreacting in terms of what you're evaluating the situation to be, sort of calming this down or adding a bit of this into your system is kind of what you might need to do to feel a little bit more appropriate. So, this is the main set of information I'm going to want you to know in terms of how certain disorders show up and are related to what's going on in our brain. There's a lot more that we could think about in terms of brain injury. We haven't really covered anything that's entirely somatogenic, right? Nothing like traumatic brain injury or developmental disorders or diseases, except for just a little bit here with dementia. But otherwise, there are still a bunch of ways. But I wanted just to give you a broad sense of, some of the things that are affecting some of the more major disorders that we in fact will cover in this class. And just to give you a foot to begin to stand on when thinking about this, these kind of biological determinants, or these physiological determinants as we call them. Okay, so this is it for this video. The next one, I may tell you a little bit more about some biological pieces if I realize I forgot something. Otherwise, we will actually start going ahead and talking about depression proper. So we'll finally be getting into one of these disorders. That is, again, if I didn't forget anything, I think I'm right. It'll be cool to begin to think about what depression means and where it comes from with regard to all of the stuff that we've already talked about. One thing that I would ask you to do is to go ahead and look up what the different rates of depression are for different ages, different genders, different regions, any kind of cultural piece that you want to look into, because one of the things we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about when we're talking about depression are those cultural pieces, right? What's the difference between men and women? What's the difference between old and young? This type of thing. So go ahead and just do a couple Google searches, or your book may have some things. I think the DSM as well has some ranges of age for depression and this type of stuff. So apprise yourself of that, and then just be ready for this lecture next week. I will see you then.